the Jewish community is feeling increasingly concerned. And to see crowds being whipped up in this hate talk in the public festival, it's a music festival, is extremely chilling and very frightening, and it can't go unattended to.
Let's talk about how police are reviewing footage of comments made on stage at Glastonbury by the punk duo Bob Vylan and the Northern Irish rap group Kneecap. The Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy has asked the BBC Director General Tim Davie whether the corporation actually did its due diligence before the performances. Harry Yorke is the Sunday Times' deputy political editor. Tell us about what the Culture Secretary is saying. She's not happy with the BBC, Harry.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. So she has obviously made contact with Tim Davie directly, and as you described, she is seeking an explanation about what due diligence was done. And the reason for that is quite simple, because anybody who had done a bit of research on Bob Vylan would know that they have been repeatedly described as, one of the most violent bands in Britain. They often use, a lot of their songs have got very kind of charged, politically controversial lyrics. They repeatedly perform on issues of social injustice, racism, and police behaving badly. But they also are very well known to be pro-Palestine activists. So, given that the BBC had gone to the lengths it had with Kneecap to ensure that it wasn't performing live, I think the question is, well, did they actually do any due diligence on any of the other groups? Because I guess critics of the BBC would argue that this was entirely predictable. Glastonbury is known for counterculture, and we know that things are incredibly politically charged right now, given the Middle Eastern situation. So that something like this was going to happen. I guess for in the BBC's defence, perhaps it was just an oversight.
This is a broadcasting row. This is a political row. It's a row about music. I suppose there are aspects of freedom of speech as well. What do you think happens next politically in this?
It's very hard to know, really. I mean, it could just be a bit of a flash in the pan. We've had, but there has been a number of issues, I guess, around the BBC and its coverage of the Israel-Gaza conflict. Obviously, this is not the first time that the Culture Secretary has had to speak to the Director General. I think I recall in February there was a condemnatory statement from her about the airing of a documentary on Gaza, which did not disclose the links of certain people in the documentary to the Hamas ministry. But look, this is also more of a case maybe for Glastonbury as well, and whether Glastonbury wants to continue to platform certain individuals if they are going to espouse, it's one thing being counterculture and very highly critical of the government. I guess this incident yesterday, the fact that the police are investigating it and looking into incitement, that tips over into potential criminality, and therefore there is maybe a debate there about Glastonbury and the kind of acts that perform there going forward.
Glastonbury organisers have said Glastonbury Festival does not condone hate speech or incitement to violence of any kind from its performers, and a BBC spokesman said some of the comments were deeply offensive, adding it had issued a warning on screen about very strong and discriminatory language, and the set is not going to be able to rewatch on BBC iPlayer. The government said that it welcomed the decision to do this. Harry, obviously, big story, front page of the Sunday Times today about George Freeman, the Conservative MP, leaked emails revealing a company helped shape the wording of his questions to Labour ministers. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you say, we have a big story on the front this morning. George Freeman was a science minister under Rishi Sunak. He's been around for a very long time, as you know. And what we have discovered is basically leaked emails between him and the managing director of a company that was, until very recently, paying him £5,000 a month to act as his advisor. Now, what these emails show is that the director of that company effectively proposed a series of questions that George Freeman could ask ministers in written parliamentary questions, and this was done actually at George Freeman's invitation. And then what we also were able to see were the emails from George Freeman to a parliamentary staffer in which he basically tabled those questions that were proposed by the company. In some of the phrasing was copied word for word. Now, all of these questions were directly relevant to the sector that this company operates in, and it looks as though he has some serious questions to answer about whether he's broken the code of conduct governing MPs and paid lobbying. And also he held virtual meetings, it seems, in Parliament with this company and others, which again could be a breach of parliamentary rules. So he has referred himself now to the parliamentary watchdog, but the Labour and Liberal Democrats are both calling on Kemi Badenoch to suspend the whip from George Freeman while that investigation is carried out.
Harry, thank you. That's Harry Yorke there, Sunday Times Deputy Political Editor, and his exclusive investigation into George Freeman is on the front cover of the Sunday Times today. You can also, of course, read it on the Times app. On the Glastonbury story, I want to get more reaction now from the former Labour MP and one of the Vice Presidents of the Jewish Leadership Council, Louise Ellman. Louise, good morning.
Good morning.
I know you've just returned from a visit to Israel on the first evacuation flight out of there. I just wonder what your reaction is to the fact that the BBC has broadcast, and specifically, of course, the act itself, Bob Vylan, saying death, death to the IDF, and indeed some of the people who were there shouting it back, apparently in agreement.
I think this is very chilling. It's about hate speech, and it's very frightening to see a performer whipping up a crowd with hate speech, and specifically with anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jewish people on the public platform, and particularly at a time when anti-Semitism is rising. Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, is quite right to call this out, and it can't be possible and it can't be acceptable for performers at a major festival like this and the organisers to escape the laws of the land, which are against incitement and incitement to hatred, and that is simply what this is. Well,
we know a police investigation is now happening into this. I wonder if you could take first the organisers of Glastonbury and what your view is on them putting this band front and centre on one of their main stages directly before Kneecap, of course. I wonder if you could perhaps give me your thoughts on the timing of that. And secondly, the BBC broadcasting it, knowing, as I'm sure they will have done their research to find out what Bob Vylan's views on a number of these issues will have been.
Yeah, well, responsibility is across a number of people. Primarily, of course, the performer who did all these things, but the organisers of the festival too, and the BBC as the national broadcaster. Everyone has a responsibility. We're in an extremely volatile situation. Hostility towards Jewish people is rising. There are increasing reports of concerns. The Jewish community is feeling increasingly concerned. And to see crowds being whipped up in this hate talk in the public festival, it's a music festival, is extremely chilling and very frightening, and it can't go unattended to.
Glastonbury is, of course, a very countercultural festival. There are lots of figures there who are on the left. There are many who are for, pro-Palestine in regard to their thoughts. Many Palestinian flags, of course, on display yesterday and throughout Glastonbury. I just wonder whether you think this was something that was inevitable, and where the line is in your mind between supporting the Palestinian cause as an issue of free speech and freedom of thought versus the anti-Semitism that you allege has happened here.
It's perfectly legitimate to support the Palestinian cause, but this is something else. This is about whipping up hatred and hatred towards Jewish people. And it's a pattern of behaviour that's been going on for some time. We've seen hatred on our streets, Jewish communities frightened, Jewish people harassed at work, school children worried too. It's something that's developing in our society, and it mustn't be allowed to go without action taken. And we can't have a situation, surely, when it's such an important music festival allows performers who whip up hatred, and we have that chilling spectacle of the crowd repeating hate messages. It is very frightening, and it's time a halt was called to it.
What do you think the government should do now? And I wonder what you think of Glastonbury's statement as well. They have said Glastonbury Festival does not condone hate speech or incitement to violence of any kind from its performers.
Well, that statement from Glastonbury Festival just isn't enough. It can't be acceptable for people with such experience and with some anticipation of what might well happen to sit back and say it's okay to have the hate speech, it's okay to have a crowd whipped up on hatred at a very volatile time, hatred towards a minority community in this country, and say that that's okay. The organiser of the festival have to take their responsibility, as does the performer and the people who then broadcast it. This cannot be ignored. It's not just about Jewish people. It's about the nature of our society. This cannot go not being dealt with.
Louise Ellman, who is a former Labour MP and one of the Vice Presidents of the Jewish Leadership Council, thank you for joining me on Times Radio Breakfast.
So in the next few minutes, we'll look at this from the angle of the BBC. We're going to speak to former BBC executive Roger Bolton about the due diligence which is being questioned by the Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy. What did the BBC put in place beforehand to try and ensure this didn't happen? Oh, in fact, we can speak to Roger Bolton now, so we'll go to him now. Morning to you.
Good morning.
Lovely to have you with us. Just for people who don't understand how kind of these things are put together by the BBC and the questions and discussions that go on behind the scenes, what would the BBC have done in terms of due diligence to look at the possible scenarios of putting a live feed up of Bob Vylan prior to the performance? Obviously, Kneecap, they always said, were never going to be live streamed. But what conversations would have taken place before the live stream of Bob Vylan?
Well, make the point that, of course, it's an event which is organised not by the BBC. The BBC is covering it. So the basic decision to have the band is made by the organisation themselves, not the BBC, Worthy Farm and so on. And then then you look through, obviously, the bands that are playing. And the question is, what information was available to the BBC to alert them to a problem? There was enough information clearly to tell them the Kneecap was going to be a problem, so they didn't run that live, On the other hand, it's a question of free speech, isn't it? The BBC has got a record in the past of banning the most peculiar people at various times, including Cliff Richard, Ken Dodd, and Paul McCartney, because at a particular time there was trouble. So they're obviously very wary about censoring anything. So the key question is, what did they know beforehand? I think the additional problem is this. The Glastonbury will have been covered by basically the BBC music operation and the outside broadcast. How alert were they to the implications? Increasingly, everything is now becoming political, and looks a bit like here as the BBC wasn't quite alert enough to the potential problems.
And I wondered that because, and maybe this partly explains what I'm going to ask you next. The BBC, I mean, to be fair to the BBC, this wasn't on sort of BBC One or BBC Two. It was the Glastonbury channel. You had to seek it out via the iPlayer. But they carried on broadcasting Bob Vylan for around 40 minutes after there were various remarks made, one of which was obviously about chanting death, death to the IDF, which went out live. Also, which I think was what Louise Ellman wasn't specifically talking about just now, but just to clarify that when she was talking about anti-Semitism, it wasn't criticism of Israel. What she was talking about was comments made about, I'm not going to say exactly all the words, I've got swear words in, but the direct quote from Bob Vylan was, "So look, we've done it all from working in bars to working for Zionists." That's the anti-Semitism, which was also there. So 40 minutes after those two comments were made, the BBC carried on broadcasting. Why?
Well, that's a good question. And they did put, to be fair to them, they did put a note up, I think, on the screen.
They did.
So, those people, it's very difficult. Look, it's a propaganda war going on here. And this is delighting. The Israeli embassy will be delighted with this. They're ready, they're primed, they have a very sophisticated operation, and in they go, because they want to persuade everybody that any criticism of Israel is motivated by anti-Semitism. Equally, there's a propaganda war being waged by the other side, less effective. Nonetheless, doesn't excuse the BBC for not being aware that there will be people like that, and the Telegraph and the Daily Mail, who have their own arguments to have with the BBC, waiting to jump on it. So the BBC has got to be alert. This is a very minor thing in many ways. I guess a few thousand people will have watched this, but it's blown up because of the political circumstances around it.
But is it minor? Is it minor when someone goes on stage and chants death, death to the IDF, also says we all have to work for Zionists, on a public stage in front of thousands of people? People are arrested and indeed have gone to prison for saying less online in a tweet.
Well, hold on, separate off. It's organised by Glastonbury. The police are now, as I understand, investigating those comments, so we must be careful about that.
Of course.
If those comments have been are as reported, I haven't seen it, but I have no reason to suggest.
Well, I've watched the video. So yeah.
So what I mean is, it may well be that there are legal proceedings that happened. The question is, could the BBC have reasonably expected this to happen? What did they do when it did happen? And I don't think they handled it very well. But I do think you should recognise that, one, very few people will actually have watched this. The BBC has said it will not play out any recordings of the band, and it had already agreed that it would not cover Kneecap live. You've got to be careful. On the one hand, there's free speech. On the other hand, there are different views throughout the country that BBC's got to represent. There's a big propaganda war going on, and there's a highly efficient group of PR campaign and people waiting to, leap on this. I think that the irony of this is, I haven't the faintest idea whether Bob Vylan or Dylan or Willan or whether Kneecap actually care. I suspect they're rather naive, or they're calculating and publicity seeking. And the more attention you give them, of course, the more their record sales go up, and the more what they say on stage is repeated everywhere.
But there is a difference, isn't there, between someone standing on stage and saying, I see what's happening in Gaza and it really disturbs me, or even saying, I believe there should be a free Palestine. There's quite a leap to then saying, death to the IDF, and we all work for Zionists.
I agree there is. But what people were watching was not or shouldn't have been a political rally or a discussion or whatever. It's a group of performers who are jumping up and on the stage and then suddenly say something. And the key question is, should the BBC have been aware of that? And then how quickly did it respond? I haven't seen the particular offending piece. I don't discount, I don't question that those words were said. Were they heard? In the gallery, I don't know. Were they heard properly by the crowd? They would be heard by people nearby.
The crowd chanted back death to the IDF when they chanted it.
I know, okay. And the BBC then put a sign up, and I think the BBC should have cut away and cancelled the broadcast. But I think you should be careful of building this into something it isn't. And it is not a major, offence in my view. It's something the BBC should not have allowed to have happened. But the more publicity we give it, the more we assist those people who are involved in this propaganda war. In the end, what we need to be able to do is to report on the ground in Gaza, and no independent journalists are allowed in there. And also what we need to do, and the BBC needs to do, is much more contextual reporting to explain to people like the rappers that it's rather more a complicated situation than they think. But don't also ignore the fact there are a group of people delighted that this has happened and who are piling in primarily to try and silence concerns about what's happening in Gaza.
Thank you for coming on this morning. I'm grateful to you for your time. As former BBC executive Roger Bolton, lots of your messages coming in. Thank you for that. Worth saying, exactly as Roger just said, there was a message essentially which came up on the screen during that on the BBC iPlayer. During this live stream on the iPlayer, it was reflected what was happening on stage. A warning was issued on screen about the very strong and discriminatory language, and the BBC said we have no plans to make the performance available on demand.